Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to OSW Daily, where each day we talk about the trends, work-related trends, with industry experts and thought leaders. I'm your host. My name is Steve Todd. I'm Global Head of Workplace of NASDAQ, and I'm also the founder of open-sourced workplace.com. So what are we going to talk about today? Let's get straight into it. Today's agenda is going to be around labor trends during COVID, localized pay for new remote workers. A lot of people are relocating, and what does that mean for their pay as people move across different cities, and how will emerging tech shape office post pandemic? So to discuss all this today, I'm very happy to bring Elisa Konik from Cushman and Wakefield to the show. Elisa is someone I've got to know over the last few months, and I'm very excited to bring her and have her on the show. So Elisa, how are you doing? Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to meet everybody remotely.
Yes, remotely indeed. So you're with Cushman and Wakefield. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be a Cushman and Wakefield and the real estate industry as well.
Sure, absolutely. So actually, I'm a lifer at Cushman, like many of my colleagues. I've spent my whole career here, spanning about 13 years. I've actually had the privilege of working in a multitude of different roles at Cushman, both in terms of service lines and functions as well as geography. So basically, shortly out of college, I started in our Connecticut office in our valuations and appraisal business, kind of helping our clients figure out the value, the financial value of their assets, kind of highest and best use. A little bit after that kind of stint, I moved into our consulting practice in Chicago, and I spent several years there helping clients figure out how to best optimize their business goals for reasons other than real estate. So when they were thinking about opening up a new manufacturing facility, opening up a new HQ, reevaluating the way in which they were hiring talent, they would come to our team to help basically benchmark new markets for entry, real estate being one consideration, but typically it would come after talent, after kind of the density of talent, the quality of talent, the cost of talent. Um, Kind of like a long story short, over the next couple of years, I moved to both New York and then eventually to the Bay, where I am today. And my focus has evolved from traditional consulting to a little bit more of kind of both a brokerage and a consulting mix. I also have the privilege of running our tech advisory practice. So I have a specific interest in working with technology occupiers who, as I'm sure you know, are amongst the most dynamic occupiers in the market today.
No, absolutely, and wow, right? What an introduction, and that's a lot you've covered. But did you always set out with the passion for real estate, or did you just fall into it? How did you get into that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In university, I studied cultural anthropology, and I know you and I have spoken about that before. There's actually a few of us out there in the
Yeah.
commercial industry who had a background in cull-lamp. And for those who aren't familiar, that's not paleontology. It's not the study of bones and pure history. It's really the study of culture and why people congregate together and what ties them together and how do they build tradition. And it's really a fascinating field of study. And I think when I graduated, I wanted to not only continue to work with people dynamics, but I also really wanted to touch and feel something tangible. And I think real estate provides that for a lot of us. I mean, I think those in the sector really like to see something, feel it, touch it. It's wonderful to kind of walk down the street in any given community where we work and say, oh, I worked with that client and now they have 300 folks working out of that office. So it's a really rewarding profession, and I think it's got some, every day is different. So that's what's keeping me going.
Yeah, and you mentioned New York and Chicago, and then moving to the Bay Area. What was it like moving from leaving New York and going to the Bay Area?
Good question. I am always going to be a New Yorker at heart, and I miss New York terribly during COVID because normally I'd probably be there, 3 times a year, and all my family is still there. So, longtime New Yorker, still have my 516 area code for any of my, fellow Long Islanders. But I fell in love with Oakland. I came out here for a summer about 7, 8 years ago, and I took a bike. I just rented a bike and drove around Oakland and drove around San Francisco, and I thought this was me. It's like I had a kind of very visceral reaction to the Oakland community, and it's been very welcoming, and I've never felt more at home in my adopted new hometown. But I certainly have a lot of love for New York and, of course, for Chicago and Chicago style pizza and everything that Chicago has to offer.
Absolutely, it's kind of funny. I'm the first one of the first cities I went to in the U.S. was in Chicago, and I worked there when I finished college. I loved it. I loved it. But my experience, to be honest, was in August, which is a very different experience to being there in December or something like that. So I have to appreciate that. But yeah. So Oakland, I mean, obviously there's a lot of widespread news about people vacating the Bay Area. What did you do yourself?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, right now I'm talking to you from Tahoe, which is definitely a headline that we've, read quite a bit about in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And I do think that for someone who studies talent and labor trends, there's absolutely something worth discussing when we think about migration out of the Bay Area. But you and I have spoken about this a little bit in the past. The reality is, when you look at the Bay, which has an incredible ecosystem, one that's practically unrivaled for tech in the US. There has always been, in the last 5 years, some net outbound migration happening. I mean, the cost of living in San Francisco has grown pretty significantly. Housing shortages exist. We have a very unfortunate kind of homeless crisis here. So there has been outbound migration, and anybody that pretends otherwise is not reading the facts. That's true. But there's more to the migration than just somebody leaving the Bay and moving to Miami or Seattle. In fact, our suburban markets outside of San Francisco proper, when I'm thinking of Alameda County, where Oakland is, or Marin County, where you've got Larkspur and Mill Valley, those markets during COVID-19 have actually experienced incredible volumes of demand. In fact, in July, they hit their median home price highs. So there was still an incredible appetite for people in the Bay to remain in the Bay. But what they have been saying is, I don't know that I want to be an apartment dweller. I don't know that I want to be in a dense urban area, but they are moving outwards. So that's happening. And then if you look at some other residential real estate trends to think about migration, one stat that I picked up on about last quarter, looking at Redfin data, Compass data, a host of different systems. If you look at Redfin data for, I believe it was second or third quarter, and you looked at how people were searching for homes, in the Bay Area metro, roughly 80% of people searching on Redfin were still searching for homes in the Bay Area. Now, of course, we don't know if these are just dreamers that are dreaming and they don't make a move. But that trend is exactly the same as what happened the year prior. So about 80% of people within the Bay continue to look in the Bay for homes. About 20%, again, year over year, very consistent, are looking for homes outside of the Bay Area. And the locations that they're looking for homes are also very consistent year over year. They include Sacramento, which is typically number one, so kind of regional migration trends. And then that's followed by other cities who have a very similar cultural fit to San Francisco on the western coast of the United States. And that includes locations like Seattle, Portland, Austin, LA, and so on and so forth. So it'll be an interesting trend to watch to see if some of the migration is temporary and people turn back to the core of San Francisco. But I don't think we're going to see any sort of dramatic mass exodus for the knowledge workers here, at least not in the short term.
So you actually do believe that these folks they're moving to an area where they can still commute into the Bay Area as and when needed with their jobs? Is that what you think the logic is?
I think that the majority, and majority is just over
Yeah, yeah.
50%, that is what is going to happen. I think there is still going to be an incredible amount of folks, both in the Bay and in other main cities, who change, who like make a systemic, fundamental change to their life. I think that is absolutely happening, but I don't think it's of the scale that some of the media
Mm.
headlines. I just don't think the data shows that yet. I think that what we see is regional migration and not necessarily like completely leaving in an individual state for another, in the majority. But, time will certainly tell. I don't think we're going to just be, elastic band and split right back to where we were. I think some of this will be permanent change. I just think it's going to be much more measured than what we like to read in the media.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to know if you know what sort of, if you think about those state migrations, what are the percentage deltas year over year that that's, because I think that's going to be an interesting trend. But I don't know if you've been back to the Bay Area recently since you went up to Tahoe. I actually drove through New York City last week, and it was frightening how empty it was, how it felt, and yeah, it's just it feels such a shame to see such a vibrant place looking so stale, looking so empty, and I'm sure, like New York, San Francisco, they'll all rebound tremendously well, but obviously, whenever I hear you talk here, you can see that this is your passion.
Mm-hmm.
This is
Yeah.
something that really matters to you, and you do this deeply, but you've also a very unique way how you go about getting your data, and you've just sort of shared some of that with me. And I'm actually was really impressed, just the lengths of the detail you go to, the amount of phone calls who you call, all these different things. So I'd love you to really share how you really get to the source of some of these trends that you're able to identify.
Sure, absolutely. So when we think about talent analytics, one of the most prominent sources here in the United States is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and kind of aided by our census and a quarterly census that happens in a much, more frequent clip, so on a quarterly basis. That really makes the foundation of labor intelligence. Now, with anything that's government reported, it's excellent in that it's typically exhaustive, and objective, but there's a lag time. So when we think about things like what is COVID-19 doing to the world, the government unfortunately is typically always about 3 quarters behind. That's one thing to keep in mind. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics is something that we always look to when we think about labor trends, when we think about salaries and how salaries are going to evolve over time, when we think about county to county migration. So, to your point, I think that we'll be able to get some really nuanced data about migration in early 2021. By
Mm.
that point, we'll know if something was a more permanent change as opposed to temporary, and we can get pretty close into the geographic data. And then beyond kind of the census, the types of things that I typically look at, I love looking at education trends, because a labor market today is just, a snapshot of where we are today and maybe historics. But as we continue to work with universities and better educate the next generation of knowledge workers, it's really important for us to look at the programs that are out there, how employers can work with local economic development agencies and universities to breed this next gen. So I look at things like the National, Education Statistics, NCES, how many completions have occurred, how has that changed over time. And then, Steve, I think, something that you and I spoke about, I think data is really nuanced. And one really funny stat that got socialized here in the Bay, about 3 months ago, was that Tahoe had exploded, and that, I heard the rumor change over time. It was 100 new students enrolled in the Tahoe public schools. Then it was 500, and then it was 800. And by the time I heard that 800 new students were enrolled in the Tahoe public schools, I thought, that requires a fact check. And, I actually called the local school administrator for the Tahoe Public School District, which accommodates over a dozen schools. And they told me they only had 60 new enrollments. So the reality is you can usually get to good data. We can move beyond anecdotes pretty quickly. And that's because so many interesting people are out there helping to make this all happen. But you're right. I'm definitely, in love with data, and to the extent we can get some interesting stats, we always try to go out and do it.
No, no, and it's fun. It's fantastic whenever you sort of see get to the nuts and bolts and down to the real what is the real story. But the other thing you do, Elisa, is you share this, right? And I'm going to pull up a slide where it just illustrates some of the work you do, how you do it, but then you put it out for everybody else to see. And we talked about salaries just there, right? And we talked about, okay, remote working, it's going to happen through time. What impact could that potentially have on what people are going to be paid? And you've been collecting the data, and trust me, what I have on the screen is the small subset of the information you've pulled together and made available for everybody. And there'll be links below for folks to go and check this out. But in essence, you're tracking how salaries may shift as they're remote working, because this is a big conversation point, because people don't know what actually the actual new salaries will be, and will it be shifted because of remote working.
Yeah, it's a really great point, and a few things to maybe unpack there that you mentioned. I mean, people that are working for employers who have said, yes, we're going to support distributed work going forward indefinitely, there has still been some ambiguity as to how that person's salary changed. So when we think about migration, we might not yet have seen the full extent of it because people are still in lockdown, questioning how their employer is truly going to unpackage this whole thing. And it's been so helpful, I think, for us all to share. I mean, you've done a fabulous job with this community, kind of exposing lessons learned and people sharing best practices. So what you have up on here, that tracker, is just one way for us all to share with one another. Um, yeah, no, thanks. It's really intended to bring light to this new, let's call it a phenomenon. But it's been going on for decades. People have been localizing pay for quite a long time. But because of COVID-19, Facebook was one of the first to make a public statement about this. They said, yes, for certain groups of our employee population, we're going to allow you to work from anywhere. But the devil's in the details. And they also said concurrently with that statement that they were likely going to localize pay, because if somebody moved outside of the Bay Area, which has a very high cost of living, and they move to Kansas City, they're probably going to experience a pay cut and a pay adjustment, because historically, if they had been hiring that role in Kansas City, they would have been paid according to Kansas City pay bands. And it's just an interesting thing that's going on right now. And the technology sector is one of the most generous in terms of publicly reporting this type of information. So for anybody that wants this access, we have this as a live Google tracker, and we have links to all the public statements. So nothing confidential here, all publicly reported.
No, no, it is good. And I'm really curious to say, so do you think that that is possible, what Facebook have basically said? Do you think with the competition that is there for that talent, and especially the specific type of talent that they're talking about, do you think they'll be able to reduce those salaries and retain the talent?
I think that's the hot question right now. And I actually don't think that technology employers as a whole are going to be able to do that to the extent they want to, exactly because of what you just said. Because if two things are happening, if tech employers are saying you can work anywhere, that means that tech employers can recruit anywhere. And maybe a population of developers in Pittsburgh who maybe only a year ago had the option of, let's just say, 10 employers to choose from, now all of a sudden, hypothetically, they have 100. And so now those 10 local employers have to compete with 100, and that 100 has to differentiate themselves in some way amongst each other. So I do think that we're going to see some of the larger enterprise tech employers localize pay, and that's going to be something that they're going to be transparent about. I think some of the smaller tech employers who don't necessarily have the luxury of standardizing pay, of the reverse, they can't pay Bay Area salaries. They're going to be a little bit squeezed, and they're going to have to get creative about what type of additional benefits they offer their employees. I think compensation is so important to the technology sector. By and large, it's the greatest factor influencing a tech worker's job selection. So if we can't be competitive on pay, then I think employers are going to have to find other ways to be competitive. And maybe that's workforce culture, maybe that's time off, maybe it's first Fridays away from the office. But I do think that at the end of the day, the conversation in 6 months from now is going to be competitive packages that go above and beyond comp, and how we make sure that in this level playing field, employers remain attractive to their employees. I think you're spot on. It's going to be interesting to see.
And so it leads to another question, which, I don't know if you have time to think about this. I'm sure you'll have. You're a deep thinker, but do you think there is a opportunity for a uniform remote pay scale, given what you've just said, right?
No, I know. I think that there's a lot more history to localizing pay than to standardizing pay. People have been localizing pay for decades. It's just not been such a public conversation piece. Some of the tech employers on that list, have gone so far as to say, like, we'll have one pay for our major hubs and then standardized pay for everybody else. Or Reddit has said, we're going to standardize pay for the entire US, and that's going to be one pay band. I think that employers that do that are going to be very attractive
Mm-hmm.
to candidates. Now, whether they have the financial model, and that can be attractive for them based upon their own P&Ls, I think time will tell. I think that there's just a lot more history to localizing pay, and I think it would be unlikely for us to see that go anywhere in the next 10, 15, 20 years, because the reality is cost of living adjustments exist. There's a different cost to living in one market versus the next, whether it's within a country or country to country. And I just think that employers are always going to try to find ways to manage their kind of labor cost arbitrage. And I just don't see a way for us to disappear, to shed that
Yeah.
from the conversation.
Yeah, no. I think it's a great point, and yeah, and one of the other areas you touched on earlier that you really get into is tech, emergent tech, right? Given you're the Bay Area, the exposure to the types of companies that you have, and again, you being the good soldier you are, you go and you collect and you package and you share everything. And I'm going to pull up something that you've just been put together, and sort of as we think about, and we can see in the marketplace today, there are so many new tech developments, right? Companies are innovating. Workplace analytics companies are emerging out of the woodwork, but also the existing ones are really upping their innovation, and it's been tremendous. And again, I'm going to put a link in, and here you have a long list of companies who have just popped up. And my good friend Mark Gilbreth, Liquid Space, who is a friend of the show, who's been on, and just give him a shout out there. But you've got him tracking there as well, and it's so many, and it's a wonderful resource. So thank you for doing this. But whenever you sit here, what is the emergent trends that you see, and what are the ones that you didn't really see coming that you thought that's really clever?
Interesting. Yeah, it's a good question. So maybe just another plug to industry networking, CoreNet. I'm sure most of the listeners here participate in CoreNet or members or at least know of it. So this particular tracker we built in coordination with CoreNet. So it was a multifunctional group of people. And for those who access the link, and again, it's a live living document, there's two tabs, one around kind of design and find real estate, and the other kind of working that real estate, kind of the employee experience. To your question, I think one piece of application that existed, well before COVID, but maybe didn't have as much exposure, was Matterport. And in fact, we had been using Matterport here, in the Bay for a couple of years to do virtual tours, but it didn't really take off very much. I mean, we used it for some select opportunities that we had, and we thought it was a really great resource for people to navigate a space instead of visiting it. But it didn't go very far back in 2017, 2018 outside of the residential real estate sector. Now come to 2020, it's almost a given that every real estate listing out there is enhanced by a Matterport or some competitor 3D virtual tour. I am so glad that that's the case, because it's a tremendously valuable tool for all of us real estate professionals going forward. So very happy. In terms of like a new technology, Dasana, which actually just happens to be the very first app here on the list. I spoke with Michael, the founder of Dasana, early in the pandemic, and I thought he was really spot on. It's similar to what Liquid Space and DeskPass are doing, but has its own unique take. And what these apps are doing, it's saying, okay, a distributed workforce is here, and it's probably here to stay. And what employees are telling their employers is that they want flexibility more than anything else. They don't want to be at home full time. They probably don't want to be in the office full time, but they want flexibility of choice. And what groups like a Dasana, DeskPass, Liquid Space, We Work on Demand have now said, informed by the pandemic, is here's an app, and on any given day, you, employee, can choose where you want to work. You can, using the Dasana application, which I think is unique, and you can say, I want to go work at my home office. Sorry, not my home office. I want to work in my employer's office, the one that I've typically have gone to historically for years. And I want to travel by BART and get to San Francisco and work there with my colleagues. Or you wake up one morning and you say, gosh, I've got so much going on. I've got to take the kids to soccer practice. I just don't want to spend the time commuting. So using an app like a Dasana, you can, in the same exact intuitive interface, book a flex office space. Perhaps it's a WeWork or a Regis site closer to home. And instead of booking that on your own personal credit card, the experience is such that you use company credit, so employer paid credits, so that it's an employer endorsed and sponsored location that fits their brand. And then you can book that flex space using company tokens. And I just love that because it gives the employer still some control and transparency. They can still track office demand. They can even track to see which flex spaces are getting the most popularity amongst their groups. And they can still control, economies of scale and billing. But it really puts the employee experience and choice back into the employee. And I think we're going to see more of this type of an evolution over the next 2 years.
100% agree. And I've actually seen some of these applications and used them at NASDAQ. And what I find really interesting is to see the choices that employees make and how it shifts day to day depending on what they're doing, right? So if they're going to see a client, they'll pick a very specific location and type of office. If they're meeting with their team, again, they'll pick somewhere that's completely different, but actually obviously very convenient for those people who they're going to meet. It's just fascinating to see. And then what I'm doing is I'm looking at this and going, okay, well, why are they using that space? Why are they using this space? What is it about those things that actually they find really useful? So I learn, so whenever I'm thinking about my own real estate portfolio, I can then bring that in-house and actually enhance the offering again to attract people to the office should that be what we want them to do. So it really is a really great opportunity on both sides, and I love the convenience of everything that you mentioned. But is there anything that you've seen though that sort of you didn't see coming or really surprised you? And I know about you, the co-working one, I mean, I think most people thought co-working was really going to struggle once this pandemic hit. And what we've seen the evolution of this is actually they may be the ones that come out of this in the most robust market segment of the whole real estate world.
It's so funny you say that because, and it doesn't directly answer your question, but at the very beginning of the pandemic, Airbnb, had been in March, like, getting ready for an IPO. And then all of a sudden the world comes crashing down and everyone's thinking, oh goodness, poor Airbnb. And then the longer we get into the cycle of the pandemic, it's like, well, Airbnb is a winner. Airbnb is actually a beneficiary of this change. And now they're leading up to having one of the most successful IPOs of 2020.
On
So
Nasdaq, by the way, on Nasdaq, just to throw out a plug there as well. So
pre-play the plug there.
there
No,
you
exactly.
go.
Right. I just think that's what's so fascinating about this because even our own mindsets have changed during it. But when you ask that question, no specific tech comes to mind outside of I do think this is an opportunity for us to make our buildings smarter, like literally, right? Smart buildings, utilization tracking. We've been talking about doing this for decades as an industry sector, and we're still not quite there. And air filtration, right? I mean, it also
Mm.
was something that I think we've all wanted clean air, particularly in key markets like India and China. But now it's becoming a little bit more of a priority. So maybe it's not surprising, but it's definitely a welcome change that I hadn't personally put a lot of thought into. And now I spend so much of my day thinking, what is bipolar ionization and how do we change out the air and how often should air be filtered each or air changes how many per hour. So I think as a whole, our industry and our buildings hopefully are going to provide a safer working environment for everybody long term. And hopefully that just accelerated that change.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's fantastic, and you know this is where you look at the well building standards and what they were putting in place, and actually this is their real opportunity to excel right now. So hopefully that's a standard that can sort of get more widely adopted. But you know, Elisa, it's been great chatting with you as we wrap up here. But before we do, I just want to ask you: is there anything that we didn't touch on that you want to mention before we finish?
Oh, well, thank you. It was such a fun interview. I would just say that it's been really fun collaborating with everybody. It's been a really tough pandemic. I think the light's at the end of the tunnel, and I feel so thankful to have colleagues and peers in the sector who just wanted to lean in. And thank you to everything that you're doing to keep this community going. So that's about it.
No, thank you, and I really appreciate all the work you do and how open you are to sharing it. I think there's a lot of people who are of great minds in our industry, so I really applaud and I really thank you. So thank you for being with us today, and folks, please do reach out to Alyssa, and there'll be links in the description below. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye,
Cheers,
everyone.
bye.